Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are going to talk about Plato's Euthyphro today. We spent the last couple of weeks talking about the Apology. As we now know, that is something of a record, maybe a not completely accurate record, but something like a record of Socrates' trial. We are moving both backwards and forwards here by moving to the Euthyphro. So let me explain what I mean by that. On the one hand, internally, right, looking at how the dialogue is set up, internally, it takes place in a time before Socrates' trial. Okay, this is the day that Socrates was indicted, which means he's going to the court to hear the official charges read to him, right? And it says that in the text, that this is the day of the indictment. That's what Socrates says to Euthyphro, that he's being indicted, okay? So that would have to be before the trial. First you go and you get indicted and you find out what the charges are, then you get to leave the court, and then you come back for the trial and defend yourself. Of course, you get to know what the charges are, so you can prepare to defend yourself on the day of the trial. So as far as the internal setting goes, this is prior to the Apology. However, we have reason to think that the Euthyphro was written a few years, probably after the Apology. We're able to, I've mentioned this before, we're able to use word choice, grammar, things like that, to order these texts to try to at least group them, into the earliest, middle, later group. But it does seem like Plato's powers of argument are a bit more mature here, right? Is he better able to capture how Socrates really argued, or have his own powers of argumentation blossomed, and so this is less representational in a way of how Socrates really argued? Hard to say. I think you can hear Socrates here. I think this comes across as the same guy that we saw in the Apology, but this is very sharp. Very sharp argumentation. However, that said, again, it sounds like Socrates, he drives Euthyphro into contradiction repeatedly, right? We saw him do this to Miletus during the trial, and of course Socrates explained during the trial that this was why he was on trial. It wasn't because he had done anything wrong, it's because he had gone and sought wisdom from people, and then they tried to share their wisdom, and then he found holes in that wisdom, right? He found inconsistencies, and that is exactly what we see in the Euthyphro. So this is an early dialogue. We can put these into general groups for sure. So it belongs with the Apology and the Crito and some other dialogues in a group that we consider pretty early, right? But then at the same time, it just reads as more mature, and I don't think we'll ever know for sure if that means, again, Plato is better capturing what Socrates was actually like, or if Plato himself is maturing and he's actually not representing Socrates as well as he did in the Apology. We can't know. Okay, well that said, we've got some of the setting now, right? This is the day of Socrates' indictment, so let's move on from there. Socrates and Euthyphro just sort of run into each other. That's the way the dialogue is set up. They both go to the King Archon's court on the same day. This is also called a portico. So it's a colonnaded building. It's an open air building. It's just a little bit raised, and it's in the Athenian marketplace, the agora. Okay, so it's a very public space. They run into each other. They're curious about what's going on. Euthyphro is sure that Socrates wouldn't be indicting anybody. So that's interesting. Plato's trying to tell us how other people perceive Socrates, right? So apparently Socrates just wouldn't be the kind of guy to go to the law courts. And he told us this in the Apology, but now we're hearing it from some external party, right? So that's interesting. It's not, in a way, it's not informative because it's still Plato talking, but it's interesting to see Plato put this in someone else's mouth. And it's kind of like what we already said about the Apology. I mean, this would have to be somewhat accurate, right? People are reading this and they remember Socrates, and so this has to have sort of the ring of truth, right? Socrates was known not to be a litigious individual, let's say. A lot of Athenians were, but not Socrates. Okay, so they run into each other. Socrates explains about the indictment. He explains what the charges seem to be. I mean, he hasn't heard them read yet, but of course he's already sort of heard rumors about what he's going to be charged with. So he explains that this guy Miletus is coming after him as someone who's corrupting the youth, and Socrates praises Miletus a little bit. I don't know if this is irony exactly. It's sort of halfway toward irony, right? Socrates says, yes, of course you'd want to start out by helping the young. You'd want to save the young from corruption, and then you'd go and try to help the old people. That's the way to proceed. So that's serious as far as it goes, but presumably he doesn't really mean it when he says, so of course Miletus knows what he's doing and is going to be a great benefit to Athens. So that does prompt Euthyphro to praise Socrates. Maybe that was part of the intention. Right? Euthyphro says, I think they're going after the heart of the city in a way by going after you, Socrates. So Euthyphro thinks well of Socrates. They're clearly familiar with each other, right? Euthyphro, let's say something about Euthyphro and then talk more about the interaction. We don't know much about him, except he clearly is one of these experts that Socrates questioned. So he must have a reputation for religious knowledge, right? And you certainly get that impression as you read the text, right? So again, he fits into that category that we are already familiar with from the Apology, right? Someone who is thought to be wise, someone who's reputed to be wise. And it's clear from the text that Euthyphro has prophesied in the assembly, and then he claims that all his prophecies have come true, right? And he sees a connection between himself and Socrates as a result, right? So Socrates, like I said, explains what the charges seem to be about. I already mentioned the corruption charge. He mentions that Miletus is claiming something like this. He innovates in religious matters. Euthyphro immediately says, yeah, because of your voice, because of your daemonic voice that comes to you, right? And so again, that's interesting. So it's still Plato, but Plato is putting this in Euthyphro's mouth. And I think that's interesting because it tells us about what Plato thought other people thought about Socrates. Maybe I said that in an overly cumbersome way, but in other words, Socrates had a reputation. By allowing Euthyphro to make these statements about his impressions of Socrates, we sort of get the idea of what the general reputation of Socrates was, right? So he's the heart of the city, so people do think of him as being good generally. He is probably known for some kind of connection to virtue, since he goes around asking people about virtue, but people also are aware of this voice that speaks to him, and that makes Euthyphro want to lump Socrates in with the prophets, but then Socrates clearly distances himself by saying something about only you prophets know how Miletus's accusations will turn out, right? So he's saying indirectly, well, you've tried to lump me in with the prophets, but actually I'm no prophet. And this might have something to do with the fact that the voice only tells Socrates what not to do. It doesn't tell him what to do, and so presumably it doesn't tell him how things are going to turn out. He could we did see him sort of infer how things will turn out because of the voice's silence. So we have to sort of admit that that's the case, right? In other words, as you'll recall, the voice didn't stop Socrates from giving a certain kind of defense that led to Socrates' execution. And so Socrates inferred from the silence that death is not such a bad thing. But that's different from the voice actually telling Socrates what's going to happen. And so he seems to try to make that clear in the text by sort of putting it back on Euthyphro. Hey, you're the prophet. Only you prophets know how the trial will turn out. Okay, so let's get to why Euthyphro is at the court here. That's interesting. So the story is that Euthyphro's father killed this day laborer, or we could call him a wage laborer. There are a lot of different translations of the term here, which is something like theis. And it means, the guy wasn't a slave, so he didn't have to be with the Euthyphro household. He wasn't owned by them, but he wasn't really independent. So if you look at some translations, he's called a dependent. That just means he doesn't have any land of his own that he can farm. Okay, so he's a day laborer or a wage laborer. He works the family's land, and so he's sort of attached to this family, but not owned by them. Right, and why would Euthyphro's father kill this guy? Well, the day laborer got drunk and killed a household servant. Right, now the household servant would be something like property, right? I mean, on the one hand, let's give Euthyphro's dad some credit and say, well, he was just mad that somebody got murdered. But then on the other hand, he probably was thinking, hey, that's my servant that you just murdered, right? So anyway, the day laborer kills the servant. Papa Euthyphro gets very angry. He has the day laborer bound and put in a ditch. And then he sends someone to the mainland. They're on this island called Naxos when this occurs, right? So he sends someone to the mainland to go find a priest. The word in our translation is interpreter, but that means interpreter of the sacred scripture, Homer, Hesiod, what have you. So it's a priest, basically. So someone has to get on a boat and go to Athens and find this priest and find out what should be done with the day laborer who's bound up and in a ditch. And this takes a long time. Okay. And so then when the messenger comes back from Athens and gets to Naxos, the day laborer has died, not terribly surprisingly. He wasn't fed or given any water or protected from the elements while this messenger was going to get word from the priest. Okay, so again, Papa Euthyphro kills this guy. And the reason Euthyphro is at the court is because he's prosecuting his own father, right? And then the family is in an uproar, right? The whole Euthyphro family. I don't know what else to call them. We don't have any other names. We don't have a last name for the family or anything. So the whole Euthyphro family is in an uproar because, first of all, Dad didn't kill, the day laborer. He just put him in a ditch and he happened to die. And then secondly, what does it matter if Dad killed the day laborer? Because the day laborer was a murderer anyway and doesn't really deserve our consideration. Okay, so the family is angry at Euthyphro. But Euthyphro is very confident. And this is an important part of the text. Euthyphro is very confident in his knowledge. Okay, so what does he claim to know? Let's look at the text here. Right, there are at least, pardon me, here I am. There are at least a couple things that Euthyphro is claiming to know in this text. Right, so looking at 4b, going into 4c, Euthyphro says to Socrates, "It's ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think it makes any difference whether the dead man's a stranger or a relative." Right, Socrates is sure that Papa Euthyphro killed a relative because there's no way that Euthyphro would prosecute on behalf of a stranger. And then Euthyphro says it doesn't make any difference. It's ridiculous not to see that the sole consideration should be whether the killer killed justly or not. Is this a defensible killing? If it's an indefensible, unjustified killing, then it's murder. That's what murder is, right? Okay, if he did kill him justly, in other words, let him go. If he didn't kill him justly, then prosecute. If, that is to say, the killer shares your own hearth and table, for the pollution's the same if you knowingly associate with such a person and don't cleanse yourself and him by bringing him to justice. Okay, and I wanna skip because that's one thing Euthyphro knows. I'll state it in my own words here in a second, but I want to read the other thing that Euthyphro knows, and that's at 4e. Euthyphro says, "You see, it's impious, they say." My family, he's referring to. "You see, it's impious, they say, for a son to prosecute his father for murder. Little do they know, Socrates, about the gods' position on the pious and the impious." Okay, so that's two different claims that Euthyphro is very confident in, right? And the claims have to do largely with piety and impiety, right? And then, of course, that's the topic of this dialogue. What is the pious? But why does that question arise here? Because of these things that Euthyphro says he knows. Number one, he knows that his household is polluted. That was the first passage I read. Okay, the Greek word here is miasma. It's like a stench, right? That the gods find offensive. So if you do something really bad, this miasma, according to what the Greeks believe, attaches to you, attaches to your household, and the gods are disgusted and horrified. So you have to do something to get rid of the miasma. Okay, so that's number one. There's a miasma, got to get rid of it. Number two, the way to get rid of it is to prosecute Papa Euthyphro. Okay. So it's impious, they say, for a son to prosecute his father. Little do they know, right? I mean, that's one indication. Of course, if you read that fully in context, it's quite clear that Euthyphro is not just saying that it's morally permissible for him to prosecute his father, but that it's the pious thing to do. It's not just morally permissible, it's morally good, because it falls under the rubric of piety, and piety is a virtue. Okay, so that's at least two things that Euthyphro knows. There's a pollution, it's pious of me to prosecute my father, and that'll get rid of the pollution, right? Okay, so Euthyphro is a typical victim of the Elenchus, in a way. In other words, Socrates flatters him quite a bit. Socrates says, wow, you're so wise. Only someone really advanced in wisdom would be able to do this, Euthyphro. Wow. I really want to become your student. That's what he says to Euthyphro. I want to learn from you. You clearly know so much about piety. It's amazing. No one would do this unless they were wise. I think this is like really ironic here, right? Because, right, Socrates is skeptical, I would think, of what Euthyphro is doing. It seems wrong, right, to prosecute your own father. Not as much to us, but it's really central to Greek ethical norms to defer to your parents, right? To do what they say, to honor them. So this seems like outrageous behavior, but instead of saying, "Wow, Socrates," instead of Socrates saying, "Wow, Euthyphro, that's really dumb," he's saying, "Wow, Euthyphro, you must be really advanced, because this is far beyond anything I would try." I wouldn't know how to do this correctly. You're blowing my mind here. So why don't you teach me about piety, right? So he comes across to Euthyphro as well as he can in this very flattering way. And strategically it's a good way for Socrates to start out, because he's going to say a lot of harsh, critical things, right? And it'll be hard to keep Euthyphro in the conversation. But if you start out with a lot of flattery, and say, "Oh, I really want to know, you really have a lot to teach me," that's going to help keep Euthyphro talking to Socrates about piety. Okay, so let's get to it. Socrates asks, what is piety? But we have to look at how he asks the question. So let me make a general point here. Socrates has these criteria that Euthyphro's answer will have to satisfy, and he doesn't tell Euthyphro off the bat what all the criteria are. The criteria emerge over time, right? And another word for criteria is like standards, requirements. So we could talk about Socrates having requirements on the kind of answer that Euthyphro should give, right? What are the standards that the answer has to satisfy? What are the requirements it needs to meet? So anyway, Socrates doesn't just say what is piety, he indirectly says, here's a criterion, right? That's just the singular of criteria. Here's a criterion that the answer needs to satisfy. He just sort of fits that into the question. It's a bit sneaky. Euthyphro doesn't pay much attention to it. Euthyphro gives a bad answer that doesn't satisfy the criterion, and then Socrates just throws in a couple other criteria, doesn't really say, oh, and here are more criteria. Instead, he acts like, well, that's what I asked for all along. But there do seem to be 3 separate criteria. Other commentators seem to agree that there are at least 2 criteria here. I would say there are 3. But let's look at the question. Let's see what we can get out of this question here. Okay. So this is at 5C going into 5D, right? That's where Socrates asks this elaborate question. He says, now then, in the name of Zeus, tell me what you were just claiming to know so clearly. What sort of thing would you say the holy and the unholy are, whether in cases of murder or anything else? Or isn't the pious itself the same as itself in every action? You see what I mean? He's not just saying what is piety. Hey, isn't the pious the same as itself in every action? Don't you agree with that? But he's not asking it as a separate question. He's just sort of throwing it in as if that's part of asking what piety is. And conversely, isn't the impious entirely the opposite of the pious? And whatever is going to count as impious, isn't it itself similar to itself? Doesn't it, as regards impiety, possess one single characteristic? Or, so Reeve here uses the word characteristic, but that Greek term there can also be translated as form. So maybe Reeve is deliberately avoiding the word form because Plato has this kind of elaborate theory of the forms that isn't here in this text, because this is a very Socratic text. This is one of the early dialogues. But whether Reeve is trying to avoid the word form or not, the Greek here can be translated as form. So what is Socrates saying? On the one hand, he's saying, what is piety? And then on the other hand, he's saying, hey, look, when you tell me what piety is, you should give me this single form of piety, right? Because on the one hand, there are lots of different pious actions. But then on the other hand, if we call them all pious, we're saying there's something they have in common, in virtue of which we are able to label them as pious. And it's the same with the impious, which is the opposite of the pious, right? Impious actions vary quite a bit, but then there's something they must have in common, in virtue of which we call them impious. And so I want you to tell me what they have in common, right? That's all built into the question. There's some form or characteristic, if you like, that they have in common. Tell me what that is. Okay. And then I've already spilled the beans here. Euthyphro gives a bad answer. There's only one criterion right now. Tell me what's the same among the pious actions, across different pious actions. Euthyphro fails. What he says at 5D going into 5E, very well, I say that what's pious is precisely what I'm doing now, prosecuting those who commit an injustice, such as murder or temple robbery, or those who've done some other wrong, some other such wrong. regardless of whether they're one's father or one's mother or anyone else, whatever. Not prosecuting them, on the other hand, is what's impious. Okay, so what kind of answer is this? It seems like a list. Prosecute the wrongdoer, right? Not a list yet, but overly narrow. Whether it's your father or your mother, whether it's for temple robbery or murder. So it's kind of like a list, or that's how I think of it. Prosecute the murderer, even when it's your mother, even when it's your father. Prosecute the temple robber, even when it's your mother, even when it's your father, and so on. So it's an open-ended list, but it's a bit of a list, and it's also, even though it's a list, it's quite narrow because it's just different kinds of things that you should prosecute. That's what's in the list, right? So not surprisingly, Socrates doesn't like the answer and is able to explain to Euthyphro that hey, that there are other pious actions besides prosecuting the wrongdoer, and there are other impious actions besides failing to prosecute the wrongdoer, right, Euthyphro? And Euthyphro does agree. He gets it. He struggles with some of the other criticisms, but this one he seems to grasp pretty well, right? Now, as I said, the failure of this first account, which is just sort of a list account, but this is, if I refer back to the first account of Piety, this is what we're talking about. This is the first account. It's already failed because it's too narrow and specific. Because of its failure, Socrates repeats himself, tries to remind Euthyphro what he wants, but then he seems to state a couple more criteria when he reminds Euthyphro what he wants. Okay, so let's see here. This is this would be 6D going into 6E. Okay, Socrates says, "Do you remember then that what I urged you to do wasn't to teach me about one or two of the many pieties," right? We don't want this multiple pieties stuff. Don't teach me about that. But rather about the form itself, by virtue of which all the pieties are pious. Well, that sounds pretty heavy to me. The form itself, by virtue of which all the pieties are pious. Okay, so I do think of this as a metaphysical criterion. I don't think we have the full-blown theory of the forms yet. I already said that. He seems to be saying, I want the form that makes the pious actions pious, right? Because they're sharing in some characteristic that literally there's a characteristic, there's a form that's partly constituting the actions. So this is a metaphysical issue here. Like they're sharing in the form, and it's making them pious. That seems to be what the criterion is. You see, you said, I believe, that it was by virtue of one characteristic that the impieties are impious and the pieties pious, or don't you remember? Oh, I do indeed, says Euthyphro. Euthyphro actually never said that, by the way. That all came out of Socrates' mouth, and Euthyphro said, yeah, of course I could do that, but this, it wasn't coming from Euthyphro. So there's a criterion that the form is singular, if you like. There's a criterion that it constitutes, I think that's a good word to use here, it constitutes the pious actions as pious, so it's a metaphysical criterion. And then the next one I would call an epistemological criterion. Socrates says, then teach me what that characteristic itself is, in order that by concentrating on it and using it as a model, I may call pious any action of yours or anyone else's that is such as it, and may deny to be pious whatever isn't such as it. Okay, so this criterion is, I need a model. I need something that tells me definitely whether an action is pious or not, and whether it's impious or not. All in a single account, right? So those do seem different, although scholars argue about how many criteria there are exactly. We need unity, right? We need a single account. We don't want two different forms of piety. We want something that makes the pious pious, that constitutes them as pious, something they actually share, so it actually inheres in them. But also, this seems separate. It needs to be a model. I need to gain knowledge from the account, right? Knowledge that will enable me to tell which actions are really pious and which aren't. So sometimes I see this as asking for an algorithm, right? And I think of an algorithm because that has definite input and definite output, and there's this linear process that leads from the input to the output. So you could think of it that way if you want. So this is an epistemological requirement, this third one, or an algorithmic requirement. Sometimes I like to think of it that way. Okay, so I hope this is all making sense. We've got 3 criteria now that poor Euthyphro has to satisfy. I'm sure he's not grasping them all, not quite yet. Maybe by the end he'll grasp the criteria, but he'll have no idea how to satisfy them. Okay, so anyway, what does Euthyphro come up with here in response to these 3 criteria? At 7a, Euthyphro says, in that case, what's loved by the gods is pious, and what's not loved by the gods is impious. Okay, and then Socrates refines that, actually, but he doesn't say he's refining it. But when he repeats it back to Euthyphro, he does change it a little bit. He says, come on then, let's examine what it is we're saying. A God-loved thing or a God-loved person is pious, whereas a God-hated thing or a God-hated person is impious. And the pious isn't the same as the impious, but its exact opposite. Isn't that what we're saying? That's still at 7a. And Euthyphro says, it is indeed. It's important to state the refinement because what Euthyphro literally said is, if the gods don't love it, it's impious. That's not really adequate, but Socrates just rephrases it so that it is. We wouldn't think that things that the gods are emotionally neutral about are impious. So lots of things wouldn't be pious or impious, right? Presumably, if I pick fruit in the orchard, and it's my orchard, is that pious? Is that impious? It doesn't seem like it's either. If I go buy something in the agora, it doesn't seem pious or impious. I suppose if I bought the wrong sort of thing, it could possibly be impious. But generally speaking, I go and I buy a coat. It's neither pious nor impious. So anyway, if the gods love it, it's pious. If they hate it, if they have this adverse feeling about it, if they're repulsed by it or offended by it or something, then it's impious. Okay, so that's better, little better than what Euthyphro said. Okay, so second account. What's wrong with the second account? Well, I'm going to jump to the chase and then explain. I'll jump to the chase by saying, well, it fails to meet the third requirement or the third criterion. So the second account fails to meet the third criterion. The third criterion is that epistemological or algorithmic requirement. We have to be able to use the account to gain knowledge. Okay. So something goes wrong here. Before Euthyphro even stated the second account, he brought up how the gods sometimes fight among themselves. Okay, and Socrates, by the way, doesn't really believe that, or he has trouble believing that the gods fight among themselves, and he recognizes that that's a problem for him, right? That people are looking at him askance because he does have trouble believing in these stories about the gods that suggest that they fight. From Socrates' point of view, the gods are perfect and good, and so they don't really have anything to fight about. However, this is Euthyphro's account of piety. Euthyphro's the expert. Euthyphro's supposed to tell Socrates about piety. Okay? And Euthyphro says the gods fight. Right? So now that we've got the second account in place, Socrates wants to sort of investigate what they fight about. Right? So in the case of human beings, Socrates says, certain things we can become reconciled about. If we quarrel, if we fight, sometimes it's easy to reconcile and sometimes it's really difficult. And it seems like there are certain topics that we fight about, that lend themselves to reconciliation, and then other topics we fight about that do not lend themselves to reconciliation. Okay, such as what? Well, what if we disagree about how tall the building is, for instance? You could imagine people having a bit of a spat. Hey, that building is, 30 feet high. No, it isn't. That can't be right. Now, that's the sort of thing you could clear up, right? You could find a way to measure the building. And then there are a lot of questions like that, mathematical questions or measurement issues or scientific questions. There might be a reliable procedure you could use to answer the question. So if the issue is how tall the building is, if the issue is, what's the diagonal of that square, like we're working on a problem in geometry, there are reliable procedures that we can use to settle the spat between us, right? So Socrates investigates, what kinds of things are we not able to reconcile or be reconciled with each other about? Value questions, right, is what it comes down to. So let's see if we can find a little list from Socrates here. Okay, so at 7e, Socrates says, Then according to your account, my noble Euthyphro, different sets of gods too consider different things to be just or fine or shameful or good or bad. For if they didn't differ about these, they wouldn't quarrel, would they? That's right, says Euthyphro. So these are value questions, right? We've got the good and the bad, we've got the fine and the shameful, we've got the just and the unjust. So this is plausible. When are we not able to reconcile? When we have these fights about value questions, right? And that's because there's no reliable procedure. And let's not be anachronistic. I know the tendency of students is to then want to say, once we get to this point, we argue because these things are totally subjective. Don't import that into the text. That's not there, okay? So be careful about that. First of all, it's not necessarily true. That's sort of part of our cultural context, is that we believe things like that. But it's not necessarily true. You know, ethics exists as a discipline. People try to give accounts of how values could be objective, right? Maybe some of those accounts are correct. But also, leaving that aside, go ahead and believe they're subjective if you want. That is not the belief in the text, okay? What Socrates is saying is there's no reliable procedure. Once people start arguing about justice versus injustice, there is no reliable procedure for settling that. That's what he's saying. So people get very upset, right? And we also need to note that people are pro-justice. They're certainly pro what they think is justice, and they're anti-injustice. They don't like injustice. It makes them angry, right? And similarly, they like the fine, or that could also be translated as beautiful. They like that. They don't like the shameful. They like the good. They're anti-bad, right? So these values provoke certain kinds of responses from us. This is very important to what Socrates is saying. On the one hand, the gods disagree, according to Euthyphro. That's not Socrates' view, apparently, but the gods disagree. What do they disagree about? Value questions. And then you list values and you realize, the gods love these values and they hate these values, right? Now the second account says what the gods love is pious and what they hate is impious. Well, they love justice and beauty and the good, right? And they hate injustice and the shameful and the bad. So they're fighting about values, and they have different feelings about values. So where is all this headed? Well, it helps to give an example. This is one that comes up in the text. So Zeus didn't like the way that Cronus was treating him and his siblings, so he bound him, he fettered him, right? So that Cronus couldn't bother him and his siblings anymore. So it was a kind of punishment, right? So Zeus punished his father, which set, to Euthyphro's mind, that sets a good precedent for Euthyphro, who's trying to prosecute his own father. Okay. So Zeus liked what he did to Cronus, his father, right? Zeus was pro-fettering Cronus. He thought it was just, I bet. He thought it was a just punishment. And he loved it. Okay, so to that extent, it's pious, according to the account. What the gods love is pious, what they hate is impious. But Cronus is a god. We could call him a titan if we want, but he's divine. He's a kind of god. He didn't like being fettered. He presumably hated being fettered. He thought it was unjust. He thought he could do whatever he wanted to his own kids. which is what Zeus is punishing him for, right? He wasn't treating the kids well, but, you know, from Cronus' point of view, they're his kids. He can do what he wants with them. So, so Zeus is treating him unjustly, and he hates it. Okay, so then the overall point here is the second account is not good because it says of an action that it's pious and that it's impious. Bad algorithm. It should have given us determinate output. Instead, it gives us ambiguous output. You know, it looks at something like Zeus fettering Cronus and says it's pious and it's impious. Or, you know, Cronus castrated Uranus for similar reasons. Uranus was eating his children. And again, from Uranus's point of view, it's like, well, they're my kids. I can eat them if I want. And Cronus said, no, I'm going to castrate you, right? And so the castration of Uranus is loved by Cronus, who thinks it's just, so then it's pious, right? But then Uranus thinks, you can't do that. I was just eating my own kids. They were mine to dispose of as I saw fit. So from his point of view, you know, what Cronus has done to him is unjust and he hates it, and so it's impious, right? Okay, so the second account fails. It doesn't provide a good model. It doesn't provide a good algorithm. So, as I've said, it doesn't satisfy that third criterion. Okay. So now we're getting to the really famous account in the Euthyphro, right? With a sort of famous rejoinder from Socrates. So Socrates really is the one who comes up with the third account based on where the discussion has been so far. But he does, of course, get Euthyphro to agree because Euthyphro is the expert. So if Euthyphro doesn't agree, he can't really investigate the account. But what he ends up deciding or concluding from the discussion is, well, look, the gods disagree, and this causes some actions to be pious and impious. But maybe we should consider this account, which sort of solves the problem by stipulation. You know, what if the pious is what all the gods love, and what they all hate is impious? Right? So in other words, you know, sure, the gods disagree and they fight because Euthyphro said so. But then some things they agree on, and so let's focus on that, and let's say that's our account, that what all the gods love is pious. And so let's find that in the text here. This would be 9c, near the very end of 9c, going into 9d. Socrates says, if you like, let's suppose that all the gods consider the action unjust. Right? What his father did is the reference there. Euthyphro's father killed that day laborer. Let's suppose all the gods think it was unjust of Papa Euthyphro to do that, and that they all hate it. Is that then the correction we're now making in the account, that what all the gods hate is impious, while what they all love is pious, and that whatever some love and others hate is neither or both? Is that how you'd now like us to define the pious and the impious? And Euthyphro says, oh, what's to prevent it? What's to prevent it, Socrates? What could possibly stop us? But then there's more of an explicit agreement just a bit later at 9e, Euthyphro says, all right, I'd say that the pious is what all the gods love, and its opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious. Okay, please understand, so important. I say this every semester to different students. It's important to understand that you can't criticize the third account by saying the gods disagree. That was a good criticism of the second account. The second account was what the gods love is pious and what they hate is impious. And then it was important that the gods disagree, because then it turned out that some things were both pious and impious at the same time. So we're stipulating now that there are things that all the gods love. Socrates just conceded it. Let's suppose, he said, that all the gods hate what Papa Euthyphro did to that day laborer. Is that what we're now saying? That there are these things that all the gods love, and there are these other things that all the gods hate. And that's what makes things pious and impious. So the solution is by stipulation, but it's still a solution. You shouldn't criticize the third account by noting that the gods disagree. That's not a good criticism. We're merely supposing that the gods agree on some things. Still, that's the supposition, that's what we're working with. It doesn't make sense to bring up the disagreement of the gods now. We're trying to focus on things they might agree on and sort of stipulating that could happen. So the disagreements don't matter anymore. That's not the issue. What is the issue? Okay, well, it really is summed up in this question here. Socrates says to Euthyphro at 10a, consider the following. Is the pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved? That sort of sums up what's wrong with the third account, so then we need to unpack it. So the third account says what all the gods love is pious, what they all hate is impious. Socrates is raising this question of priority. We could call it, we can call it other things, I'm sure. But there's a question of priority. Which comes first? Is it that it's pious and then they love it because it's pious? Is the piety prior? Does the piety exist first? Right? Or does the love come first? So the gods love it, and then because they love it, it's pious. Okay? Now, by the way, Euthyphro and Socrates agree on the answer to the question. Excuse me. Eventually, they agree that things are loved because they're pious. So, for instance, this comes up in more than one spot, but for instance, at 10d, Socrates says, now what are we saying about the pious, Euthyphro? On your account, isn't it loved by all the gods? Yes. So is that because it's pious or because of something else? No, it's because it's pious. So just to be clear, there's a definite answer here. Socrates says, is the pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved? And there's a lot of hemming and hawing, but eventually the answer is, well, they love it because it's pious. Okay, so the third account fails, to be clear. Now we're gonna get into some more technical stuff after we explain how the account failed, but it's important to sort of pause here and say, okay, third account failed, right? because both Socrates and Euthyphro want to say that the gods love the pious things because they're pious. And that doesn't fit with the third account. Why not? Okay, well, again, the third account says what all the gods love is pious and what they all hate is impious. Now, in order for that to be an account, it should satisfy the criteria, the three criteria. So, not surprisingly, now, this account fails because of the second criterion. And I say not surprisingly because that's the criterion that remains. The first account failed because of the first criterion. The second account failed because of the third criterion. This third account fails because of the second criterion. Right? It's all very logical. It's all very planned out by Plato, right? So what was that second criterion? The second criterion was, tell me that form that makes, and that's my word. If you look at the text, it says in virtue of which, but I would say, taking it in context, the second criterion is, tell me that form that makes pious things pious, that constitutes them as pious. So then we have to read the third account that way. So that again, the third account is what all the gods love is pious, what they all hate is impious. If we take the second criterion seriously, and Euthyphro agreed to the second criterion, and he said he would satisfy it. So assuming that that's what he's trying to do, then he's saying that the love of all the gods makes pious actions pious. Or the love of all the gods is that in virtue of which the pious actions are pious, if you like, if you prefer. The hatred of all the gods makes the impious actions impious. Right? Or if you prefer, it's in virtue of the hatred of all the gods that the impious actions are impious. But Socrates and Euthyphro agree that the gods love the pious actions because they're pious. Right? So that's a discrepancy. That's a discrepancy. The third account says that piety depends on their love and impiety depends on their hate. Because the love is making the things pious and the hate is making the things impious. But then the agreement that comes later says, oh, they love it because it's pious, so then the piety has to pre-exist the love. And then by the same reasoning, whatever the reasoning is, it actually doesn't say in the text, the impiety has to pre-exist the hate. Right? So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the love of the gods makes it pious, and then at the same time a pre-existing piety provokes the love of the gods. You can't say both. You have to pick one. Right? And eventually Euthyphro and Socrates pick the view that they love the pious things, the gods love the pious things because they're pious. So piety comes first. But the third account says the love comes first. I hope we're getting this. You can't have the love depend on the piety and the piety depend on the love. It's one or the other. One of these has priority. So is it the piety or is it the love? Well, Euthyphro and Socrates agree that the piety has priority, so the third account fails, right? Digging into that a little more deeply now, going outside of the text, to be clear. Why does it fail? Well, I've already said that's not explained in the text. It's just that Euthyphro and Socrates agree that the pious is loved because it's pious, rather than it being pious because it's loved. Why do they agree? Well, what's the alternative? What if you did agree that it's pious because of the love? Well, that raises the question, why do the gods love it? Right? Well, you can't say because it's pious if it's pious because the gods love it. Right? So on the view that it's pious because the gods love it, you can raise this question, why do they love it? And then you can't answer because it's pious. Because piety just means that they love it, and there's nothing deeper to piety. So there's no obvious answer to the question why they love these pious things. Are you with me? I hope so. So this is the general problem of the criterion, right? What is the criterion for piety? Or what are the criteria for piety, right? Well, the third account doesn't answer that question. Would be another way to talk about what's wrong with the third account. It's noting that the gods love it, and it's saying that piety coincides with what the gods love. But it also seems to be saying that the love makes these things pious, and so we don't know why the gods love what they love. Again, the problem of the criterion. And this is a deep problem for Plato. I mean, I'm sure it's also a problem for Socrates. But this is a problem for Plato that drives a lot of his writing. Okay, so when we get to the Symposium and the Republic, those aren't considered Socratic dialogues, or they're not very Socratic dialogues. You can see the character in there somewhere, but those are considered Platonic dialogues, because there's a robust theory of the forms. And if you want to know why there's a robust theory of the forms, it's because of this problem of the criterion, right? There must be some answer to the question of why the pious things are pious, right? Why must there be an answer? Well, piety is important. We must do what's pious. We must avoid what's impious. That's why, right? Our actions are governed by our conceptions of piety and impiety, right? And we punish people for being impious. Socrates is about to go on trial for being impious, supposedly. There's a lot at stake here. Right? And if you don't care about piety and impiety, that's fine. That's not really where our culture is. But what about justice and injustice? The same problem recurs. Right? You could look at the first book of the Republic, and you could see Socrates there raising the same question about justice that he's raising here about piety. What is justice? What is it? Right? And you could answer, it's what people call just. You could. That could be your answer. Why are they calling it just, though? Right? There must be some reason. There must be something the just actions have in common. There must be something the unjust actions have in common. And again, there's a lot at stake. we need an answer, right? We want to vote certain people out of power because they've been unjust. They've either made unjust laws or they've applied the laws that exist in an unjust way. And we say they've got to go. We've got to vote them out. Well, why? Well, it can't just be because we're calling things just and unjust. There must be a reason. One last thing, right? And there's a lot more to this text, but we're getting what we need out of it here. But I'll say one more thing to wrap up this discussion. There's a well-known theory of art called the institutional theory of art. Okay, and it was developed by George Dickey and Arthur Danto. And basically this institutional theory of art, it's trying to explain what art is, and what it ends up saying is, well, there's this whole art world that exists, and people participate in the art world, and some people with a certain kind of authority put things in the gallery. They put it in an art gallery, they put it in an art museum, and that makes it a candidate for appreciation, right? So someone has authority to put it in the gallery, and then it becomes something that you look at and you have aesthetic appreciation for it. You look at it in a certain way to appreciate how it looks, how it appears. Now it's an aesthetic object officially, so now it's art. I think you can see the connection between the institutional theory of art, which people don't generally like. Maybe I'm projecting. I don't like this theory. I think you can see the connection between this theory of art and the problem of the criterion, right? But let me flesh it out anyway. This theory is saying if people with authority put it in the gallery, then it's art. Okay, wise guys. Why did they put it in the gallery? Right? That's the obvious question here. Yeah, they've got some kind of authority, but this is supposedly because they have good aesthetic judgment. How do you get authority in the art world? You've got to have good taste. So you've got to be able to see that something is worth looking at. That's what we want a theory of. What are they seeing in these objects, and how are they seeing it? We want a theory of aesthetic recognition. How did they see that it was art so that they then put it in the gallery? This theory is at the wrong end of things. It says, well, they put it in the gallery, so it's art. That's not what we want. That's not the explanation we want. Why did they put it in the gallery? What did they see? Right? And so the same thing is coming up in the Euthyphro. It's pious because the gods love it. Why do they love it? You need to answer that question. Right? So Socrates does accuse Euthyphro of being superficial at this point. Well, you've told me a superficial quality that the pious happens to have. Oh, the gods love it. Great. That's not the deep explanation we were looking for. What is it that really causes the pious to be pious? Right? That's that second criterion again. Okay, so this is a bit long. Surprise! I went on a bit long. This is what we need out of the Euthyphro, though, so this will be our only lecture on the Euthyphro. I hope you've enjoyed it.